behalf of our members. So our members take a percentage share, whether it's a contract or a resource, and we bring to them economies of scale and the ability to diversify their risk. It's difficult even for our largest members to have a portfolio of resources, and that's really particularly true today as we're moving to more of a decarbonized electric system. We're building large wind and solar facilities that take up very large geography, and geography is not something that most community-owned utilities have a lot of. And so participating as a group in a large project that is one single contract or one single owner, and then sharing those resources allows our members to have diversity within their portfolios and to get less expensive electricity and taking advantage of the economies of scale. So I'm going to be here tonight and answer questions, as well as talk about some of the areas like the electric grid, as well as maybe demystifying some of the capacity versus energy, and also talk a little bit about what joint action agencies are at their core. And I guess with that, I'll hand it over to Dave Koster.
Dave, I'd like to introduce you just for a minute. Dave Koster is the general manager of the Holland Board of Public Works, but more importantly here tonight, he's also the chairman of the Michigan Public Power Agency. So the way the agency is configured is every city has one representative or one member of the board, and Dave represents the chair of the board and has a unique perspective on MPPA and on the Western Ottawa County area, obviously a neighbor to the south that has been through many of the things that Grand Haven is going through as well today. So with that, I'll introduce Dave.
Thanks, Dave. And it's great to be with all of you this evening. Thanks for having me, inviting me up to this important conversation in your community. As Dave mentioned, I'm Dave Koster. I'm the general manager at the Holland Board of Public Works. This is my 29th year with the utility. I came to it really as an intern in college and was lucky enough to be able to grow and expand my career throughout the utilities here in Holland. It's 10 years that I've been in the general manager position with the organization. The Holland Board of Public Works supplies electric, water, wastewater, and broadband services, so 4 different utility services to the city of Holland and the surrounding townships that are immediately contiguous to the city. We serve about 30,000 electric customers, and I think somewhat maybe differentiated for Holland versus a lot of other communities is that 82% of our power sales actually goes to commercial and industrial customers. Pretty diverse industry set in Holland as well, so not a lot of people know that or understand that statistic, but that's a pretty significant amount of business that we're serving in our community. As was pointed out, Holland is a member of MPPA as well. We're actually the second largest municipal entity in Michigan, Lansing being the largest. Lansing is also a member of Michigan Public Power Agency. And I'll touch on a little bit later in more detail, but Holland, in our relationship with MPPA, actually also receives electric wholesale market services. But we also participate in a couple of power generation assets through MPPA that were developed and then jointly owned between MPPA and other entities like Consumers Energy. We own, through MPPA, we have entitlement for part of MPPA's ownership in the J.H. Campbell facility, about 10 megawatts of that up in Port Sheldon, just between us and Grand Haven. And then over in St. Clair, Michigan, the Bell River facility, both of those coal-fired facilities, yet there's 37 megawatts that Holland has of that. And then a smaller portion of a combined cycle natural gas plant in Ohio. That's a joint ownership arrangement with American Municipal Power of Ohio. So I really look forward to being able to share some perspectives as an MPPA member, but also as another municipal utility here, as Dave mentioned, in West Michigan. As many of you probably have followed, Holland went through a journey on deciding what to do with its power supply and made some pretty significant moves here over the last decade. So I'll be able to share some insights to what went into our thinking and planning on that, as well as I mentioned, our utilization of MPPA. So thanks again for having me.
Great, thanks. So let's get right into the questions, that the kind of the prepared questions that we had here, and we'll start with Pat. As you know, Pat, the Board of Light and Power here in Grand Haven has generated the majority of its power through the years. And just last February, shut off its or retired its Sims power plant here in town. And with that, we're buying our power through this marketplace that many here just called the grid. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what this grid is and how it works, and really maybe how MPPA interacts on our behalf in that grid.
Sure, Dave. So I prepared a pictorial that will help maybe visualize what the grid is or maybe what it isn't. So let's just talk about the picture here for a moment. So people refer to the grid, and it's really, the grid's really all of the electric system right down to the residential home. But oftentimes the grid is really, when people are referring to it, is the bulk power system or the wholesale power system. And that's typically voltages that are 100 kV and higher. And so very large voltage system that is visually depicted by large towers and generating units. So the electricity system is interconnected, and the large wholesale part of the market is regulated by FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They oversee tariffs and market operations. And then you also have another organization called NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and they focus on reliability standards and came into being after a large blackout back in the 60s. But you can think of the electricity system really as two different systems operating at the same time. And you can't get away from the laws of physics. So the system operates with operators who are ensuring that the electricity system has the proper amount of voltage, the proper amount of amperes, that the ratings on the various different lines and generating units and motors are operating in sync with each other. And so that's happening every second of every day. But alongside of that is a market that was created over time, and it's evolved over the years. And that operates under the laws of contracts. And you can kind of think of it very similar to your bank. It's a debit and credit system. When you get paid by the company you work for, they don't give a wad of cash in a truck and drive it over to your bank, and then the bank doesn't take that and stick it in a vault for you to come pick up. They really just give you a credit for the amount of money you earned. And that's exactly how the electricity system works. And so contracts really are laid over the top of the electricity system, the physical electricity system. And people that own and operate or have contracts on the system are given credit. And then when they withdraw that energy from the system as a load, that is a debit. And that's how the system really operates from a financial perspective. When that electricity is brought down to the lower level of the system, that's often called a distribution utility, which is exactly what Grand Haven is. And Grand Haven is regulated by local regulators, which is your governing board, your utility board, and your city council. And they work with Dave and his team to establish costs and rates and rules that are involved in operating the local utility system. At the larger utilities in the state that are privately held, who have shareholders like Detroit Edison and Consumers Energy, they're regulated by the Michigan Public Service Commission, which if you go across the United States, you'll see public utility commissions in different states who are responsible for setting tariffs and working with the utilities on all sorts of policies related to the safety and reliability of delivering electricity to their users. So the local electric system is really made up of users, and they also can have local generation, just like Dave Koster from Holland explained. And that's exactly what is transitioned with the city of Grand Haven. They used to generate most of their electricity locally, but that's very difficult to do. And it kind of comes back to what I spoke about earlier, which is economies of scale and having a diverse portfolio of electric supply. And small coal plants like the one that Grand Haven owned just are very difficult to operate economically in today's electric system, which is being really driven now by renewables and natural gas. And so in order to meet their portfolio needs, they need to reach out into the grid, the wholesale electricity market. And that is where MPPA comes in. That's where we do our business, is on that side of the line. And an example of that is recently, MPPA was involved in the largest solar facility in the state of Michigan. It's 150 megawatts, but instead of talking megawatts, think of it as serving 30,000 homes. It's a massive project where a city like Grand Haven can take a small share of that. And we have other projects as well that we are currently, that we've already contracted and others that we're working on. And then cities like Grand Haven and Holland can take small shares of that. So they get the benefit of these very large power facilities that generate electricity very cheaply or inexpensively compared to these smaller facilities. And they can continue to take tiny bits and pieces of that to have a diverse portfolio, because not all generators work the way they're supposed to. They all have outages. Some have performance challenges. In the case of solar, there could be different cloud cover on one part of the state versus the other. So having a diverse, geographically diverse portfolio of electricity supply resources is really the most efficient way to operate a utility. And that's where MPPA comes in, and that's where we operate on what is called the grid. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that, Dave, if there are any.
Well, I think one other question that comes up and as a follow-up to that is on your slide here, you have the word markets, plural. And sometime we've been trying to explain to our customers here in town where that market is really bifurcated into a lot of different things, renewable energy credits, and in this term energy and capacity. And what's the difference between this capacity market and this energy market?
Sure. So they're both critically important, but very different. And think of capacity as the ability to produce a certain amount of electricity when needed. And why is that important? Well, electric systems, as I just alluded to, don't operate the way everybody plans. We all try to do our best job of forecasting electric use. We try to do the best job of forecasting how much our generators are going to produce. We're involved in forecasting how much electricity we can transport over certain lines based on our line ratings. But inevitably, we're dealing with equipment, and equipment doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. And so generators fail. They don't perform at the levels we expected. Lines go down. And so we have to have enough capacity on the grid to meet those peak loads under a variety of conditions, including changes in weather, which is probably the most obvious thing that most people are familiar with. And so capacity is really, just think it's the ability to have enough electricity production on the electric grid to produce enough electricity to meet that peak demand of the system, plus an additional amount of capacity that's required for reserves to handle those unexpected changes in the electric system, again, due to weather or equipment failure. Energy is different. Energy is the amount of capacity that's produced over time. It's the volume of electricity that's produced. And the pictorial on the right there depicts it probably pretty well. This is sort of a typical electric usage that you might see on a mid part of the year for an electric utility like Grand Haven. And think of the energy as the volume that's underneath that yellow line, and think of capacity as that peak point on that yellow line. And then think of reliability. The reliability requirement is the capacity plus an additional amount that we go through a reliability mathematics within the electric system to calculate. That's the additional amount of capacity you need to have a reliable electric system. And on the left there, you're going to see different types of resources and how much energy they produce during a year. There's 8,760 hours in a year. So if you looked at a peaking generation facility like the one that Grand Haven is considering, it's really only going to operate 10% of the year. That's a very small amount of time. And it's typically done during periods of very high demands or very high prices, which are usually corresponding to high demands. It could be that there's equipment that has failed, and so those generators need to run for local reliability. But you can also see on the next column over that they produce a lot of capacity to the electric system. Almost 90% of the nameplate, the quantity that's actually put in the ground, the system will accredit it for providing capacity to the grid. So if you contrast that with wind, for example, wind produces about 35% of the year, but only provides the system about 15% of its capability as capacity. So all these different resources have different types of capacity capability and energy capability. And we are transitioning to more intermittent resources like wind and solar. And one of the challenges that we're all going to have as we transition in that direction is having enough capacity on the system to have a reliable electric grid. And we will figure it out, but it's going to come over time and a transition period that will involve new devices that probably all of us on this call don't even understand yet today. But certainly some of it's going to be electric storage. And there's been a lot of technological breakthroughs in that, and there'll be more to come. But there'll also be other tools we'll use, including demand response from those that use electricity and energy efficiency that we'll also lean on. And natural gas and other fossil fuels will still be part of the electric system. For how long, it's really unknown, but it really probably is dependent on the pace of technological innovation and adaptation across the country. So hopefully that help you understand a bit more about what capacity and energy is. And again, happy to answer any questions now or later in the presentation.
Is that the problem that they had in California this year, where they had plenty of energy, but they didn't have quite enough capacity to meet that peak during certain periods of the time, and they had shortages? Is that what happened then?
Yeah, I don't have all the facts on what exactly transpired in California, but they had extreme hot weather, which is exactly what I was talking about earlier. And it was extreme, meaning that it wasn't expected. It went on for long periods of time. The electric system in California had historically imported a lot of power from out of state, and it just happened that this particular weather event was widespread. And so all of those other states were at their peak capacities as well. So they had nothing to offer to export. And so California couldn't import. And then they had failures. Some distribution facilities and some power generating facilities had failures during that period of time. And so it was a confluence of events, really, that resulted in, the system actually having to do a protective measure, which is, cutting off electricity consumption to make sure the grid didn't have a real bad event where you have damaged equipment like melting wires and destroying generating equipment. So that's one of the examples of some of the challenges that we'll experience as we and why we need a diverse portfolio of power supply resources, not just in the type of resources, but also where they're located.
Sure. Pat, how does I'm going to stay with you for one more question here, because you're on a roll. So Dave, give me just a minute here. But Pat, how does MPPA help municipalities achieve this diversification that you're talking about? This diversification of portfolio or diversified portfolio.
Sure. So we have an analytic process that we go through, and our members, like yourself, are obviously very involved in that. And it starts with understanding what your electric load is going to be, not only today, but what it's going to be over the next 10 and 15 years. So we do long-term load forecasting. We look at the resources that are in your portfolio today and how they're expected to perform over that time period. And then we do lots of system analysis, a lot of scenario analysis, looking at different types of resources that can be added to that portfolio. And then we do that same thing in parallel with all of our other members, trying to find ways where we can marry and correlated members, so we can find areas where they can partner with each other on resources. And when that analysis is complete, then we make recommendations to our members, whether those recommendations are to go out and purchase a certain amount of power or to contract longer term with a very specific resource like a solar facility, or to invest in a particular resource. And again, our job is really to analyze all those different options and make recommendations to our members. But the two key things really and there's a lot of different things we do, and there's a lot of expertise within MPPA, but really the two principal economic foundations that we operate on are economies of scale and diversification. And diversification is something that all of us can understand, even in the, for those of us that have retirement funds invested in the stock market, you wouldn't put all of your retirement in any single company, for example. And for that same reason, we make sure that we're allocating our members' needs over as many different types of resources as we possibly can. We obviously have constraints. You know, some of our members are very small. Some of our members are the size of some of the industrial loads that Holland serves. It's literally the size of the entire wholesale public power utility. And so it's impossible for them to go out on their own and effectively manage an electric supply portfolio being that small. So it's all about sharing resources among and between each other. We do a lot of other things, which is market interfacing and a lot of other activities, but it's really that power supply portfolio management that's built on sharing resources among members to lower their risk, to help them diversify the types of resources that they use, and to give them competitive electricity supply. Because after all, our members need to be competitive. They need to have competitive electric rates for their customers, their industrial customers and their commercial customers and their residential customers. And the best way to do that is to achieve a diverse portfolio through economies of scale.
All right, Dave, here's your opportunity. Why don't you tell us how Holland has achieved that diversity, both through MPPA and some internal resources?
Sure, Dave. Thank you for that. And, I think when people think of Holland, maybe lately anyway, there's been a lot of news around, Holland Energy Park, our newest asset that we've added to our resource portfolio in town is a natural gas combined cycle power plant. And before Holland Energy Park, just like Grand Haven, we had a coal-fired power plant, our James DeYoung power plant. And both of those were kind of iconic in the area. I mean, it was recognizable assets that people sort of, related to, the Holland BPW and thought, well, that's where my power comes from in the Holland BPW. And it's true that both of those were and for Holland Energy Park are important pieces of our portfolio, but it's a lot more than that for Holland as well. And I'm not sure a lot of people understand that it's really part of a larger story. And just like tools in a toolbox, you need to have various different types of resources to meet what a utility's needs are. And there's different kinds. You have base load resources, intermediate and peaking, and I'll talk about each of those and the kind of roles they serve for in a little bit later. But Holland has all of those. Pat spoke a little bit about energy and capacity resources. Again, when you think about wind is a resource that Holland has in its portfolio as well, but it doesn't really give you much from a capacity standpoint at all. It's kind of purely an energy resource. Similarly, Grand Haven's looking at building peaking plants, and Holland has, in addition to Holland Energy Park and resources that I mentioned through MPPA, we have our own peaking plants as well. And so, part of that is kind of building this whole portfolio of resources that are going to be optimal to meet some of your needs. And how do we think about that, and how do we go about that power supply planning? Diversity is something that has been talked about a lot already tonight. And that diversity can be geographic. It could be fuel based, because not all markets move the same. When we had coal and we had natural gas, sometimes those markets would move different from each other. There was a time back in the 2000s when 2 hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast, and there was very significant run up in natural gas pricing. There wasn't a lot of change at that time in coal pricing at the time. There's also a lot of fixed price contracts that come along with wind and solar when we get those. So having that diversity of fuel helps stabilize things as well. There's another element of diversity that comes in, and that's shaft diversity. When you think about a shaft, it's the thing that generally rotates a generator around, right? We call it a shaft. And if there are multiple of those, as Pat talked about, sometimes things break down. And if you have a number of different shafts that you can build and rely upon, then having that diversity in there gives you some stability as well. So all those are factors that you think about. You know, economy of scale has been brought up tonight too for Holland. We had to think about that when we were designing our portfolio. Do we have the size to go it alone in terms of building something? I don't think we could have built a coal plant today either in Holland. I think the economy of scale associated with that, economy of scale, and really sort of the practical capabilities of building nuclear right now, don't fall to really a municipal portfolio. Natural gas combined cycle was we were on probably the edge of that, and we were big enough to do it. We had some economy of scale. Is it as big as and as much scale as what a much larger combined cycle plant is? No. There were we would have probably had a little bit better economy of scale in a much larger one. But there are other compelling reasons that we had as well. There was some local interests in Holland. Holland is known, just as Grand Haven is, for its snowmelt system, and so part of our decision making on our portfolio had to do with making sure that we had a waste heat supply, for our snowmelt system as well. The other thing to look at is the characteristics of your demand in your city. I mentioned base load, intermediate, and peaking, and the way I kind of think about those is that base load on one end of the spectrum has a pretty high cost to build it. A coal plant, a nuclear plant, these tend to be fairly high capital cost type things. They tend to have a lower operating cost associated with those. And so if you're going to run it a lot, if you're going to have that base load, like if your demand for electricity is pretty levelized and you can use that resource pretty full out all the time, then that's a base load resource that might make economic sense for that portion of the portfolio. Another resource that's kind of starting to fall into that category a little bit because natural gas pricing is so low are natural gas combined cycle plants. And they can also, though, start and stop more frequently than a coal plant can. So you can also use those in that intermediate category where maybe you're going to run it during the weekdays, but maybe you want to shut it down on the weekend and start it up again the next week to meet those demands. And then the final category is this peaking facility. And peaking really serves a couple of purposes for us in Holland. One, it's a hedge, against significant changes in market prices for wholesale electricity. Having those around allows us that if there's a very significant increase in wholesale market, we can protect ourselves against those prices by starting up those peaking plants and actually doing better than the wholesale market at certain times of the year. The other thing that it can do is it can provide that capacity resource for the demonstration that Pat mentioned that you have to make as a utility. There's a capacity market out there. So it also can be a hedge against significant changes in those capacity market prices. And then finally, for Holland, the other thing it can do is it can be a resource that if you need to restart your system because of a significant outage on your system, having that ability inside of your system allows you some additional reliability benefits from that. That's not really the primary driver for us. I don't think it would be for Grand Haven either, because the grid is a very reliable entity, but it is something to consider if you have very critical loads. Peaking can give you that ability as well. So all of those things were very significant factors that we considered. In addition to that, there are environmental targets. In Holland, we are working within the context of a larger community energy plan. That community energy plan has carbon goals for our community to try to reduce our carbon footprint and intensity over time. And so, having those environmental targets in mind helps sort of drive the decision making to a certain extent as well. And then just like as Pat mentioned before, if we thought about making an investment in our portfolio, layering in is a very smart way to go about that. Just thinking about solar, for example, 10 years ago, the price of solar compared to today was significantly higher. So if we'd gone all in on solar, or MPPA had done something for its members to say, hey, I'm going to meet all of your renewable needs today by buying into solar, and then 10 years from now, look at the prices today, we would have had buyer's remorse on that. So I think, certainly that practice of layering in things where it makes sense is also an important part of what's built our diverse portfolio. So I don't know if you can maybe pull up the slide there that is our showing our pie chart for Holland. If you could share that, Dave, real quick. I don't know if that's available to you. And if it's not, that's fine. I can
we
speak
got it right
to
here.
it.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So yeah, if we go back to that slide on slide 9, there you go. So in 2010, as we were starting our journey in Holland, you could see we had about 40% coal in our portfolio, and a good amount of that was the James Young plant. We were relying upon and working very closely with MPPA for market services to buy power for our portfolios. We were buying a lot of power from outside Holland. And then the others, a very small amount of natural gas and some renewables, about 4%. We've invested pretty significantly over the last 10 years to meet our goals of our community energy plan by building Holland Energy Park, but also putting in about 37 megawatts of wind. And we have about 13 megawatts of the solar farm that Pat alluded to, that is this 150 megawatt farm. Holland is actually a recipient from that too. So our renewables are increasing. In 2018, it was 12%. It's now up to 15% with the additional wind over the last couple of years and the solar that we put in. But you can see there, it's not just Holland Energy Park. There's still a number of different wedges to that pie, and we'll continue to shape that and move that as we go forward. We know that there's certain coal that's going to be retiring from Detroit Edison's Bell River plant by 2030 and the Campbell 3 plant by 2040. So our going forward plans are layering in, as Pat talked about, additional renewable supplies, on top of the portfolio that we have here. So you'll see that green wedge continue to increase and the gray wedge continue to shrink over time here over the next couple decades.
Just a follow up on that, Pat, and maybe you can expound on this a little bit, is if Grand Haven showed this same mix here for the people on the audience, if we looked at 2010, this entire pie would have not only been the same color, it would have been from the same shaft, from the same location, 100%, and we would be selling from that. We not only have 100%, we had 115% or so selling outside the community. So our mix, and then as that renewable portion kind of expanded, we got more of that renewable portion, but the rest of it was all red until last year, and now that entire portion went away. So this idea of rebuilding this layering, we have a lot of opportunity for layering, and a lot of difference of, and Holland has had the luxury of building this portfolio over time. We're starting it almost all at one point. So the one thing that we're focused on at this point in time is building that diversity through MPPA, and then potentially building a peaking type resource in Grand Haven. Is that similar to do other utilities operate more like Holland? Do they operate more like Grand Haven is going to be, or do they operate somewhere in between? I mean, the assets that communities own throughout Michigan, what type of assets do they primarily own, particularly the smaller entities?
Sure, Dave. Well, most public power utilities, there's 2,000 public power utilities in the United States, and most of them are small. They serve 5,000 customers on average, and none of those utilities are large enough to do the large local power projects that Holland did. So the vast majority of them are partners in other larger projects, or they're partners in other power supply portfolio contracting arrangements that are done through a power supply consortium, which is known as a joint action agency. I know we'll talk a little bit more about what a joint action agency is here in a minute. And oftentimes, the only generation that they have is usually local peaking generation. that they can use for reliability purposes. And the reasons for investing in those, some are really obvious. You know, they wanted to have some local power supply in case they lost distribution or transmission interconnection to their local system. And it was something that they could build in a decent size, in a footprint that could fit inside of their city, didn't require huge amounts of staff, and could be operated quickly and easily by the folks that worked inside of that utility. So most of our members are more similar to the new Grand Haven. And I might add that Grand Haven's in a pretty fortuitous position. The electricity business, for reasons that are complex but also obvious, has really undergone a sea change in terms of the types of power supply resources, and the economics of making electricity have actually gotten incredibly competitive over the last 15 years. So Grand Haven's in a great spot to participate with lots of new resources, existing resources, and really build a power supply portfolio that relies on all the different types of resources that are used on the electric grid today, and that will be part of the electric grid in the future. So yes, I think Grand Haven really resembles more of what the average public or community-owned utility looks like.
And are some of these cities looking at additional peaking resources, either through MPPA or individually? Is that still something that communities are interested in pursuing?
Yes, they are, and we're it's a challenging time in our state, particularly. You know, we have a resource adequacy a challenge, I guess, is probably a good way of saying it. We're retiring a lot of those older baseload coal plants that Dave Koster mentioned earlier. And as we retire those resources, remember, those resources were built, they were enormous facilities, over 1,000 megawatts. So they didn't just serve 30,000 homes, you know, they were built to serve, you know, millions of homes, huge, enormous facilities. And so as they're retired, we're replacing them with much smaller gas and renewable facilities that have to be located in a lot of different locations. And so we're all grappling with, how do you continue to maintain that capacity, that thing I talked about earlier, having enough capacity to generate enough electricity when you need it the most. And so peaking capacity and other ways of providing on-demand electricity, also could be through demand response resources and others, are exactly what a lot of the smaller members are focusing their attention on. They've been able to participate in a lot of these large-scale renewables, and really trying to use that same economies of scale mindset and risk diversification mindset for peaking supply as well.
So what other advantages do communities find that are important for local generation? Pat, maybe we'll ask that one to you.
To me? Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, local generation, obviously, if you can have an electric generator close to your load, then less things can happen, right? When you generate electricity far away from your load, more things can happen along the way, both from the generator, from the transmission line, to all just the physical distance. And so having a local generator provides security to your community, that if the electricity system outside is damaged from a storm or some other type of hot weather event, that you have enough local electricity, at least to keep your key community resources on during those periods of time. You know, the other reason that utilities have local peaking generation is so that they can manage the kind of resources that they need to buy externally. So instead of, you know, focusing on participating in a large peaking facility, they can procure more and more renewables and back that up with a local peaking facility that you only operate at certain times in the year when you need it the most, when that point on that yellow line that I talked about earlier, when you're at those really, just for those few hours. I mean, if you think of you know, 10% of the year is a very small period of time. And so, you know, having that local resource there is an advantage for operating in those peak hours. You know, the other thing, it fits well. for community-owned utilities, they have the right kind of staff and the systems, and so it's sized appropriately for the type of infrastructure and resources that they have to manage those kinds of facilities. Where if you're talking about a large facility that burns lots of gas and electricity around the clock, you need a lot more staff to operate, and all those different interfaces you have in the marketplace, from scheduling natural gas to scheduling the power. So if you have a facility, again, that's right sized for utility, you don't need to have tremendous resources around those to operate it. So those are the principal reasons that a utility of Grand Haven size would have local electric generation. And it's a bridge. I mean, a lot of people are talking about using energy storage devices, and we're really excited about it. We're actually in some, I would call, probably early stage conversations with some developers of battery storage. And we fully expect in the years ahead to be adding those to our portfolio. But, you know, they have to make economic sense, and they have to be able to demonstrate a reliable production of electricity for us to do that. So I hope that answers the question as you asked it.
Dave, what's important to balancing all the priorities in the process of determining a community's energy future? And I think this is what the term that we're using a lot lately is balance, compromise, looking at all the different things and figuring out what that balance is. And talk a little bit about Holland's experience there.
Yeah, so I alluded to earlier that, you know, we're working under a 40-year community energy plan in Holland. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, that plan, electricity supply is a big portion of that plan, but it's not the only thing that's, you know, involved in there. We're looking at our building energy consumption, our transportation sector. You know, it's really more comprehensive. But within that plan, I mean, there's an overarching goals in mind there, and protecting the environment, certainly moving that needle on carbon intensity is a big part of that. But balancing that is being competitive in our energy supply and attractive to business at the same time. And so, you know, we think about making sure, again, that we're not taking a position on something that's going to be a problem for us in the future. As I mentioned, solar prices 10 years ago versus today, you know, having something that you're layering in over time helps mitigate risk, you know, associated with pricing changes. Another factor that we consider, I think a big factor, is the growing interest in distributed energy resources at the customer level. You know, there's a growing interest in solar panels at a residential level. You're seeing a lot of businesses that have sustainability goals and supply chain goals where they're trying to make sure that they are reducing themselves, their own carbon footprint. And there's a growing interest among them to have more control in their own energy supply. So I think that's another key part of balancing those priorities is thinking about, you know, how to create solutions for your customers long term. And if you box yourself in too much on taking a key position on a major investment, are you allowing, you know, the community not to have a stranded investment in some kind of plant that would, you know, be impacted by a big business in town that wants to self-generate, you know, power, for example. So I think, you know, having those things in mind, it's a very dynamic time in our industry right now, and you're seeing a lot of evolution with the growing interest in these distributed energy resources. That I think that's another factor that has to be considered as well, and it's going to be part of what Holland is thinking about, you know, as we move into some of our next selections. And I think it aligns well with Grand Haven's thinking too about, you know, having an investment in some peaking power, but having a lot of flexibility in terms of how they're layering in a diverse portfolio to mitigate that risk and to also be available to a changing customer interest over time.
Just a couple of customer questions that we have here. I think one of them has to do specifically with peaking power. And Dave, I know your technology that you're using is in a term called combustion turbines.
Correct.
And we're looking at recip engines, and maybe Pat, you can weigh in on this as well. As obviously, you know, what size what size do you kind of move to combustion turbine, and what size is maybe recips the appropriate level?
Right. So for Holland, we have a very old combustion turbine that's about 20 megawatts, and I would say that's a really small version of a combustion turbine. The ones that we use most often in peaking service are anywhere between 35 and 70 megawatts. We have two that are 35, and we have one that's just over 70 megawatts in size. So, I mean, you think about scale again on that, that's quite a bit more than what Grand Haven would have, and then still be able to have shaft diversity. Recips, on the other hand, are a lot more flexible, and the economy of scale starts at a much lower point for reciprocating engines. And so, you can get that shaft diversity and still get some economy of scale with the reciprocating engines to meet a peaking need of the size of Grand Haven. So again, an approach to problem solving might be very similar between communities, but not all communities are the same in terms of the solution that ought to be there. And this is an example of that, I think, in terms of how you select peaking capacity. If you're going to have internal to your city, Holland is big enough to where, a simple cycle combined or simple cycle combustion turbine is of skill and capable of being brought into the portfolio. But if you're going to have it locally in Grand Haven, that economy of scale might be better suited to a reciprocating engine. And I think that's just some differences, again, that economy of scale brings.
In that regard, Dave, we have another community here in Western Ottawa County that we're very familiar with, and that's Zeeland. What technology have they used to meet a similar type need as Grand Haven?
Yeah, it's very similar to what the Grand Haven is looking at. I mean, it's the reciprocating engines there. They do not have combustion turbines. They have two different plants, one in their core downtown and one out at their Riley Street substation, where they have, for peaking purposes, again, that hedge and that backup, supply in their community. It doesn't meet all their portfolio. They participate in Bell River. They participate in AFEC, which is a combined cycle plant in Ohio. They through MPPA, they participate in renewable supply as well through MPPA, and they have these reciprocating engines as peaking for their community as a hedge against that and to provide some additional reliability in their community.
Just a short question from the audience here, Pat. Is MPPA pursuing? I guess the question is about offshore wind, but maybe you could just talk a bit about the pursuit of renewables in general and what you're looking at in particular.
Sure. Well, the state of Michigan has evolved over the last 10 years. Wind was definitely the most economic resource. As Dave mentioned earlier, solar was significantly more expensive, and so wind was the resource that most of the utilities in the state of Michigan pursued. In fact, we actually built a very large addition to our electric transmission system up in an area called the Thumb, which was built to accommodate up to 5,000 megawatts, I think was the plan originally, of new wind, which is an enormous amount. It's probably 25% of the peaking capacity of the entire state. But wind's been difficult. First of all, wind resources in Michigan aren't as great as other states, particularly the mid-continent, or down into Texas, California. The wind resources there are when you just look at a wind topology map, they have better wind regimes in those areas. But the other challenge is wind takes up enormous amounts of acreage and also is very visible to the eye, and you can see it from very far away. And so, not surprisingly, shortly after wind projects started to get erected around the state, a lot of challenges started to mount with folks in terms of their horizon changing, not being able to economically participate in those projects. And the long and short of it, without boring everybody here, is that right now it's almost impossible to build new wind in the state of Michigan. And I think we'll eventually get back to building more wind, but for now, it's more or less on hold. I don't know the exact number, but I think 12 of the 15 counties with the greatest wind resource or wind regime in the state of Michigan now have passed ordinances that make it virtually impossible to build new wind projects there. So we'll get there, but it's gonna come with time and education and learning from all of us, from those in politics to all of us as residents here in the state. So we've transitioned to solar, and that is because, again, solar doesn't have that same resistance that we saw from wind, and solar has dropped tremendously in price as well. And I wish I had brought a graph, and I can certainly send it to you later, just the changes in prices in Michigan over the last 15 years for both wind and solar, and it's remarkable. And in the case of solar, you're talking about price reductions that have been in that 80 to 90% range over the last 8 or 9 years. It's remarkable. Now solar takes up very large geography too. It's about 7 to 10 acres a megawatt. So there is large plots of land. But you can maintain an agricultural land underneath a solar. You can't farm on it during that time, but it can be returned back to that use. You're not disturbing the soil. Obviously, it doesn't have the same visibility you have with wind, and it has other attributes that are positive. Obviously, electricity typically in Michigan is highest during the summertime when it's hot and sunny out, and that's when solar is producing the most of its electricity during the year. So we're looking to participate in more solar. We've already done a tremendous amount, and our plan really is kind of goes back to what Dave Koster said, is we want to be very pragmatic about it. We want to approach it over a long time period because the technology is just changing so rapidly that tying our members to any one type of technology resource would be detrimental to their electricity portfolio. So we want to make and adapt and participate and own new projects over a long period of time. As far as for offshore wind, I think that's going to be pretty tricky. I'm not saying it can't happen, but it has a number of challenges, not the least of which is the most expensive land in our state is on the water. And the people that live there, want to look out over the water and they don't want to see wind turbines. And that's not just me saying that. I think that's a commonly understood issue all over the world when it comes to wind resources. So, and then you have the technical and economic challenge of running, cabling, all that far. So it's just, it's a big lift. Not saying it can't happen. And maybe it will someday, but I don't see that anytime soon.
Yeah, if I could jump on that too a little bit, I think, when you look at a wind turbine performance, in Michigan, I think we're looking at probably, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, likely averaging around 35% capacity factor. I think maybe pushing 40 in some places, but typically we've seen closer to 35%. And then you look at capacity factor I think as Pat kind of pointed out on the energy page that he had up earlier, it's related to the capacity or the peak nameplate rating of that device is what's possible to get out of it, and then on average, what do you actually get out of it? And at 35%, you get about 35% of the nameplate, and that's on onshore. So you could expect a very significant increase in the price to build something offshore, especially with the ice formations in Lake Michigan. It's a very challenging thing to do as opposed to building in saltwater, which still has its challenges. But with the ice formations, that's really difficult in Lake Michigan. And so if you double that, let's just say, you'd have to make sure that you got twice as much of the capacity factor out of it, or it's still going to be more economical to build it onshore. And so I just don't see that really being right now where the developers are focused on, and that's purely economical. But then beyond that, as Pat talked about, it's a very significant issue with the sight lines and opposition issues that are going to come from that in terms of trying to build offshore.
It raises. I'm gonna make this the final question, and I think, Dave, that when we do have a question here about capacity factors that I think you've answered in Michigan, but when you look at the capacity, and Pat put this up earlier in the presentation, the capacity factor of solar was about 20%. The wind in Michigan is about 35%, let's say.
Yeah.
Compare that to the wind capacities that we see out in Iowa or Kansas, and then the solar capacities that we see out in California or Arizona, might be double each of those numbers. Are we, by going into a significant portion of renewables at a lower rate than other states, are we locking Michigan into a position where its costs of power are going to be higher than these areas that obviously have higher utilization, higher capacity utilizations of their wind and solar?
Right. So there's natural advantages, right, to everything. There were, back in the days of a lot of coal generation, I mean, having a plant out in Wyoming right next to the Powder River Basin is a very attractive place to be because you avoid the transportation costs associated with rail, bringing the coal in. Same thing with wind in Kansas and sun in Arizona. And, you have very significant advantages that come from the natural availability of those energy resources. And, when you talk about 20% in Michigan, I think that's generally going to be a solar array that's large enough to be able to invest in tracking equipment to actually follow the sun. A lot of the experience that we've had in Holland, where people have put on their own solar on their house or on a business, they're seeing capacity factors in Holland closer to 15%, 16%. So, some of the challenges get greater with
David,
that.
let me interrupt you anymore. That's over the whole year too. When you start looking at
right. So wintertime
in Michigan on a day like today,
not so much on a day like today.
Are they getting in December?
Yeah, exactly, Dave. And I think that's a key point when we think about the importance of energy storage going forward, because the penetration of intermittent resources here in Michigan is going to be a challenge for the entire state. A lot of the plans that we have as municipals, that investor-owned utilities have in terms of adding more solar, puts a very significant concentration of that supply in the middle of the day. And there may not be the demand that's there for electricity, to meet that. It may cause a situation where you're actually having trouble fitting in the total energy need because the solar array is so concentrated in terms of where it's delivering that power. So, that's going to add complexities as well to investments that have to happen in energy storage, which haven't really been factored in yet, and other investments possibly in the grid in order to meet the needs of some of those intermittent resources, going forward. So it's an evolving, just as we talked about, it's an evolving situation rapidly. And that's where risk mitigation really is a key part of that, and not overinvesting in one particular thing and continuing to layer in as these changes happen is really a smart strategy given the rapid evolution that's there.
Well, I'm going to close it down with just that one final statement. I think that reflects the topic that we were talking about today, when wind might be blowing a lot more in December and January and making up for some of that loss of the solar. And then we blend that in with some peaking capacity and some potential battery storage and some base load, other facilities, and we blend that all together. That's that diversified portfolio that we're talking about doing. It's really only available through a company like MPPA for a smaller municipal utility. So with that, I thank you both for your knowledge. We do have some questions that we didn't get to here, so we will keep those on hand, and we'll answer them either directly or in some future communication. But thank you both for your participation. Any final words that you'd like to share before we go on, or is Pat, Dave? I'll give you one last word if you'd like.
I'll start, and Pat can finish it up. I guess just applaud Grand Haven, for going through this process of education and community engagement. It's key. as a municipal utility. I think that's what you'll find out of all of us that differentiate ourselves from other investor-owned utilities and other types of resources. We're owned by our community. Everything that we do goes right back into our community as a not-for-profit entity, and I just applaud Grand Haven for going through this kind of engagement process. For Holland, I know that it yielded a great outcome that we're very happy with as a community. It's paying off significantly for us, and I'm sure it will for you too to go through this effort. So keep it going and good luck with it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dave. Thanks for having me. And I've spoke to the city a couple of different times, the city council, utility board, and other community engagement. And I hope to be back. You know, I get the benefit of looking at 22 members and all the unique objectives and capabilities of those cities. And it's a fun business to be in now. I'm very optimistic about the future, despite the fact that, you know, Michigan has some challenges with respect to resources we talked about earlier. I have a strong faith in technology and innovation, and I've already seen just tremendous strides there. And I compliment Dave and his team for really being in the position they're in now. I mean, I said it earlier, and I meant it. I mean, Grand Haven's in a great spot. I mean, it's scary because you've lost this local resource that was there and providing so much of your electricity, but you're really doing your community a huge favor by providing it the opportunity to build a power supply portfolio, and your residents will be significantly better off, both from a reliability perspective, but also just the agility to participate in all these new technologies is really exciting, and the community itself should be really happy about it. So thanks again for having me.
Okay, well, for those on the call, we do have 2 other presentations 2 weeks from now and 4 weeks from now. The next presentation will focus on the environmental contamination that we're dealing with and the environmental issues on our SIM site on Harbor Island. And then the final presentation that we have planned at this point in time, 4 weeks from now, is a discussion of more in depth on what our plans are for the facilities and equipment that we're planning, that we're now looking at to install on that site. So we thank you all for participating and look forward to the additional conferences that we're going to have in this regard. So thank you all, and good night.
Good night.